I'd like to talk a little bit about my experience teaching Vietnamese refugees. That when I was a student in Monterey in the graduate school, I was going to, one of the projects was to look at a test that was used in the United States and how it was applied, and look at the subjects that were taking the test. And I looked at a variety of tests that were offered, and I saw this one called the BEST test, and it was primarily used for refugees. And as I was reading about this test, I saw the primary focus of this test was used with Vietnamese refugees, which there were quite a few in the Monterey Bay Peninsula area. It immediately caught my interest because I think young men of my generation, or maybe perhaps just my friends, that we were, I would say, fascinated with the Vietnam War, partly because a lot of us had uncles or friends or older friends who were in the war, and they passed on really incredible stories about their experience in the Vietnam War, and also from the movies that were popular at the time, Deer Hunter, Apocalypse Now. The images of war were fascinating because we didn't really know the details. We just knew about the glamour and the intrigue of the war. So I started to do research on this project. At the same time, I was working tutoring ESL. And I was introduced to a young Vietnamese woman, maybe not so young, but probably in her 30s, who was interested in learning English in a private one-on-one session. Her boyfriend at the time was a gentleman, I believe his name was Mr. Lowry, but he was an ABC correspondent who was going to be sent to Moscow, and that he was training in Russian, and his girlfriend wanted to learn some English while they were at the school. That this young woman, her name is Xuan Sheng Ve, that she told me her story about being in Vietnam, meeting this young reporter at the fall of Saigon in 1975, and how this reporter and her decided to not leave with the final plane, but to stay in Vietnam because he wanted to cover the aftermath of the U.S. pulling out of Saigon. And so they had adventures there, and so during our ESL lessons, basically I was the listener, and I was supposed to give comments on her English, but in effect I was just so captivated by her story of Vietnam, and also the collapse of Vietnam, and also her escapades in escaping. She would talk about escaping in the middle of the night, selling all their valuables, and buying gold and hiding gold and sewing gold pieces in the fabric of their clothes, so that if pirates would come upon their boat as they were fleeing the country, they wouldn't have to give up their valuables. And I remember just stopping her and say, "Pirates? What do you mean pirates?" And then she explained that during that time there were men who were in that area who were preying upon these women and children who were fleeing Vietnam. They would kill the men, they would rob them all the valuables, they'd rape the women, and sometimes put them on small little islets in the South China Seas and leave them there with a little bit of food, and after a couple of weeks they'd come back and rape them again. And so she came back, she said, to LA with a bunch of women who were devastated by their experience psychologically. And at that time, you know, there was no psychological help for these women. And so as she was saying this, it really affected me so deeply beyond the romanticism of Hollywood films, beyond the drug-fueled stories of my friends and uncles. And so several years later, when I was in Asia, and I got a call from one of my friends who was in Hong Kong, he says, "Gary, do you want to teach English here?" And I didn't hesitate one second. I said, "Sure." So I was hired by a UN-based organization called Social Services, and they were providing education and managing experience to the refugees in Hong Kong. At that time, Hong Kong was the host to thousands of refugees, and they were in Hong Kong more as they had to determine whether they were economic migrants or true political refugees. And as I found out, that was very difficult to do. So thousands of Vietnamese men, women, and children were in penal colonies all throughout Hong Kong, on the mainland of Hong Kong Island, and some of the surrounding islands. So I was assigned to a school out in the outskirts of Hong Kong in a small town called Yuen Long. And it was located in an idyllic setting. It was in a jungle, papaya plants and mango groves, banana trees. And there was an abandoned school there that the Hong Kong government gave to social services to provide education to the children. And so I was teaching English, health, and history to these young kids who were probably between 10 and 13 years old. And the idea was I was going to prepare them for relocation, either to Australia, perhaps England, United States. And so these kids were in limbo for many years, and it was an extremely disturbing and beautiful experience because number one, I got to know these young kids who were just so full of life and just wanted to learn, but they were so mischievous. That was the first time I ever had children throw chalk at my head, or while I was writing on the board, they would jump out the window and go into the mango groves and steal mangoes, and the owners would come to the school and complain, and the owners would come in the classroom and accuse my students. I would defend them, and then my students would stand up and they have big red mango stains on their white shirts. But at the same time, these kids, after I was teaching them, they went home to basically were penal colonies, where there were old prison camps that were set up with bunk beds. And so families were living in these barracks with blankets separating families for privacy. These kids were growing up in Hong Kong, and they were losing their first language of Vietnamese, and they were adopting Cantonese as their working language, since that was the language of the country they were living in. And it was a desperate situation because not only because many of these, my students and their parents were unclear what their future was going to be, because it all depended on the interview. The interview was a time when they would be asked by UN officials, Hong Kong officials, about their need to be a refugee. Yeah, they would have to apply. They needed to prove they were persecuted in Vietnam for being, for example, an ally of the U.S. Army there, or they were part of the South Vietnamese Army during the war. And so a lot of the people fled Vietnam without evidence of this collusion with the American government. So many families were stuck for many years trying to prove their case. I specifically remember an occasion I was in an island off of Hong Kong called Tai Chau. Tai Chau was a beautiful island out probably about 10 miles off the coast of Hong Kong. It was originally supposed to be a Club Med island, but that Club Med deal fell through and it became a penal colony. And a large group of Vietnamese refugees were housed there. And I went to Tai Chau several times to do teacher training, because some of the Vietnamese teachers there, wanted to get more education how to teach English. And so I had an opportunity to spend weekends there and talk with people. And one of the most unusual things that happened, I remember playing basketball with a bunch of young men. And they were all barefoot, but we were playing full court press, full court basketball, and they were running around in 90-degree heat, barefoot, and they were listening to cha-cha-cha music on the side. And I remember going over to look at their tape deck, and it was a tape deck that was playing some cassette. And I looked at the cassette, and the music was made in Santa Ana. And Santa Ana was the city I used to be living in, and I didn't realize that there was a huge Vietnamese community there. And while I was playing with these guys, several of them came up to me and they said, take a look. And they shoved a piece of toilet paper wrapped object in my hand, and I opened it up, and it was some white little object was there, and they said, bones, prisoner, I know where I can find more. Get me an interview. And so basically I was subjected to what was, I think, a common thing for a lot of UN workers there. that people were claiming that they knew where MIAs, POWs, forgotten soldiers were buried, and at that time was a very hot political issue that if some people could get refugee status if they could show that they had information that would lead to the discovery of POWs or MIAs. And again, you know, knowing very little about the Vietnam War caused me to go back to history books and read books like Fire in the Lake and learn more about our involvement in Vietnam. So after several years of working with the Vietnamese there, it really left a very strong impression, not only about the Vietnamese and their resiliency, but about, I think, immigrants in general. So as a teacher now, I teach mostly immigrants. And I don't see them as just people who should be glad that they're in this country of democracy and freedom, but I think of what have they gone through that no one will know or no one could give a damn about. And I think of my students and the difficulties that they've had, and it really makes my teaching more focused, and also makes me more appreciative of having the opportunity to teach immigrants, especially the Vietnamese.